Hi everyone, and welcome to the penultimate session with me where we're exploring some more factors related to training. And in this session we're going to be exploring agility and change of direction. So in this session we're going to explore some of the definitions and important characteristics around agility and change of direction. And then in the final session we're going to start to explore how we can train for agility and change of direction. So in this session, we're going to try and aim to understand the definitions of agility and change of direction and understand the differences between the two terms. We're also going to look at some of the phases within these parameters as well, so how we can break down the movements into different stages. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the key characteristics around being able to perform a agility or change of direction movement effectively and efficiently. So before we actually get into the details, it's important that we understand the subtle differences between change of direction and agility. Very often they're used interchangeably, but there is actually subtle differences between the two, and it's important that we understand what those differences are. So we can see we have some definitions here, and agility is defined as the skills and abilities needed to change direction, velocity, or mode in response to a stimulus. Whereas change of direction is a rapid whole body movement with change of velocity and or direction that is pre-planned. So every agility movement also has a factor of change of direction, so also always contains some change of direction. However, for it to be truly agility, then we need to actually be responding to some form of external stimulus. So that could be a player, for example, or responding to a ball movement, something along those lines, but that effectively we're responding to that external stimulus. Whereas a change of direction is just a pre-planned movement. As I've said, agility is a combination of both change of direction speed, but also the inclusion of some form of perceptual decision-making factors. And there's a number of subcomponents that all interact to inform our ability to change direction in response to some form of stimulus. So I'm just going to look at some of the different components that make up agility. So we can see from our perceptual and decision-making factors, we have visual scanning, so understanding and responding to the visual cues from a player or the movement of the ball, for example. There's also the knowledge of situations, so the experience of being in those situations is going to impact how the athlete might respond. And that is linked as well to the pattern recognition. So is there a pattern recognition of the movement of players, for example, or the actual pattern recognition within an opponent, for example? So can we see cues from hip position, from shoulder movement, things like that? All these recognition of patterns are going to feed together with some experience and knowledge of situations to inform our perceptual and decision making processes. And the ability, the visual scanning to actually look for the right cues is a key component of that. And alongside that as well is the anticipation. So the experience again on knowledge of possible outcomes, or the experience to know possible movements of players or particular movement patterns. So there's a number of different components that all feed in to an individual's perceptual and decision-making abilities. The other component for agility, or main component, is change of direction. And within that, there are a number of subcomponents again that can all impact on the individual's ability to change direction. So there's the technique, so the ability to brake and turn quickly. There is straight sprinting speed. Obviously, as you enter and exit a change of direction, the sprint speed or acceleration is going to be a key factor there in how quickly you are able to exit a turn, for example. And with that as well, there is an impact of leg muscle qualities. So what's the reactive strength of the individual? So are they able to absorb forces, for example, before then redeploying that force to some extent, so that you can actually push off for a powerful exit again from the turn. There's a relationship as well of concentric strength and power. Okay, so again, being able to push off as they exit, and also left and right muscle imbalances as well. So if we're turning in a particular direction, then if there's an imbalance between left and right, then obviously that's going to impact our ability to turn in a certain direction. And then finally, anthropometry as well. So things like muscle mass, fat mass can all influence the change of direction speed. So we'll go into a little bit more detail, particularly around these factors that influence the change of direction speed. And now it's also important as well that we can classify our agility movements. Okay, and there's a number of different classifications that we can think of, and with them comes a change in kind of difficulty for the movement. So first off, we see simple agility, so there's no spatial or temporal uncertainty, and here I suppose technically we could regard it as just change of direction. So there's no reaction to an external stimulus. The stimulus is from the athlete's own movement. So an example of this is a gymnast floor routine. They have a pre-planned activity. The athlete initiates those movements, and there is no kind of response to any external stimulus. The next classification is temporal. So this is where there is temporal uncertainty, but the movement is pre-planned. So the example they use here is a sprint start. So the movement out of the blocks is pre-planned. The athlete knows how that movement is going to go. And there is still, though, no certainty in terms of when they're going to have to respond. Okay, so whilst they know that the start gun is coming, there's no certainty as to when exactly that is going to be. So there's some element of reactivity within that. The next classification is spatial, and this is where there is spatial uncertainty, but timing of movement, again, is pre-planned. So the examples I use here is some sort of receiving a service in tennis, for example. So there's a narrow window of time when the ball must be served. So you know it's coming at a certain point. Okay, you can see the movement as well from the racket. You know when it's going to be hitting the ball, but there's no certainty as to where that ball is going to go. Okay, so there might be an idea that's going to go within the box, for example, when serving in tennis. However, there's no certainty as to whereabouts exactly the ball is going to go or what the speed it's going to be traveling at. Okay, so there is some spatial uncertainty still. And then finally, there is universal agility, and this is where there is spatial and temporal uncertainty. So there might be a movement of an opponent, for example, but an athlete can't anticipate where the athlete is going to move or when they're going to move. Okay, so whilst again you might have an idea that a player is moving, they might look like they're going to move body position or change direction. There's absolutely no certainty as to when that change of direction will occur. So we can see that there's a lot more factors involved when we're talking about universal agility. So it's important to understand that then when we're trying to develop agility is what is the type of agility that we are going to need for that individual. Okay, and what is the type of agility that we actually want to develop in that individual. And now when we look at any change of direction, we can actually break down the movement into three distinct phases. So if we look at change direction here, then we can see the player initially, it's still moving at a high speed. And then as they go to change direction, we start entering into a braking phase. And so we have this braking or deceleration phase, okay, as the athlete slows down. And then just as they finish decelerating, they enter into a transition phase. So here we have this transition or stance phase where transitioning from decelerating into re-accelerating out of the movement, and then obviously re-accelerating out to get to the next shot. So from that transition phase, then a push off into the re-acceleration phase as they go for the next shot. So there's clear 3 distinct phases to any change of direction. So we need that initial deceleration to slow us down. We then need that transition, okay, where we get a transition from the deceleration out into the re-acceleration phase, where we can then go into the next shot or the next movement. And if we look at the actual mechanics of change of direction, okay, here we're going to focus on a lateral change of direction. Obviously, you can have just a quite linear forward then back change of direction, but this is probably the most common change of direction that we see within most sports. And so as we enter into this change of direction, you have that braking phase, as I mentioned in the video, and we get that initial deceleration with that inside leg pressing into the ground. Okay, so absorbing some of that force, trying to decelerate the body. And you then get a rotation of the body so that it's perpendicular to the line of initial travel. Okay, again, helping to facilitate then this body position, which gives us a nice wide and stable base when you step with the outside leg, getting a nice straight line between the ankles going to the shoulders. So we're ready then for obviously an effective push off for recelerating. But as we're still braking, we're getting the body going lower to the ground, getting a low center of mass, and then leaning the body into the direction of desired travel. Okay, so we're pushing our center of mass back towards the direction that we subsequently want to go on once we've finished actually braking. Once we've decelerated and gone through that transition, okay, so we get a push off in that transition with the outside foot, and then we get a repositioning of the inside leg to initiate and continue the push off. Okay, and then we get a crossover step with the outside leg again, getting that push off to initiate the acceleration. Okay, and then we start entering into the acceleration phase. And as we come out of this change direction, then we start looking more at actual acceleration mechanics. Okay, so keeping again a low center of mass, getting that roughly 45-degree angle, okay, and getting that triple extension through the hips, through the knees, and through the ankles in order to accelerate the athlete back out of this change of direction. And so if we look in just a little bit more detail around the mechanics of this change of direction, we can see that when the foot plants, this outside foot is planting, get a high level of force being placed into the ground. And we need an absorption of that force, but then also a redeployment of that force as we propel ourselves back the way we came, okay, onto the new direction of travel. We get a dorsiflexion in the opposite foot so that it's primed, ready for accelerating again. You can see as well we have our center of mass outside our base, so it's leaning outside our base and heading back towards the direction that we actually want to go in. Okay, so we get about this axis of rotation through the hips. Okay, and then we get triple extension through the hip, through the knee, through the ankle. Okay, we've got that good 45-degree angle as they're actually pushing off. Okay, and then we're getting good flexion of the hips, knees, and ankle again, ready for that drive phase as we want to accelerate out of the change of direction. And now, obviously, the angle at which we're changing direction is going to significantly impact the velocity at which we can both enter and exit a change of direction. Okay, so we can see from a paper from a few years back the different levels of braking that's going to be necessary depending on the scale of directional change. Okay, so we get a nice figure on the right here where any change of direction from 60 all the way around to 180 degrees is going to require significant amounts of braking. Okay, so not just in that moment where we actually change direction, but also in the steps leading up to it. Okay, there's not just going to be about 1 or 2 steps. With a greater directional change, we're going to need to apply braking over a longer period, okay, in those subsequent and prior steps to the actual change of direction. Okay, so we can start to engage in some sidestep or even pivoting within these sort of changes of direction. Now, when we start getting to around a 45 to a 60 degree change of direction, then there's a more moderate level of braking required, and we might also get some sidestep strategy in as well, but typically we would have a much lower overall amount of braking within this change of direction. And then anything under 45 degrees of change, then there's going to be fairly limited braking requirements. Okay, so there might be some crossover cutting strategy within the sidestep or after the sidestep. So, but ultimately, maintaining the actual velocity is going to be one of the key components here. And you should be able to maintain a relatively high level of velocity when changing below 45 degrees. So it's important that when we are training for agility and we're trying to understand what the requirements are for some form of agility, we need to think about what type of agility we're actually asking the athlete to undertake. So if we know that it's going to be directional change of over 60 degrees, we know that that's going to require significantly more braking and therefore loading than, say, if we're doing anything below 45 degree change of direction. And just to illustrate how the scale of change of direction and technique used can influence the force that actually then plays through the body, we look at this figure here, we can see that for a 180 degree change of direction in a 505 using a jump turn, we get a higher absolute force peak that's going through the body, so over 3 times body weight, but then we get a shorter overall ground contact time, okay, because of that technique, compared to if we, for example, use the outside leg turn for the 5.0 test, again 180 degree turn. So whilst not the highest peak of force body weight, you get a much greater overall impulse because we get a much longer ground contact time utilizing this technique. And then if we look at the reactive agility test, so a 45 degree angle, okay, again we see a slightly lower peak force, okay, but there is a much shorter ground contact time compared to, say, the 505 test with the outside leg turn. So we're seeing a lower overall impulse through that technique, through that scale of change of direction. So it's just to illustrate how the force profile can differ depending on the amount of change of direction that we're subjecting an athlete to. Now, there's a number of factors that can influence someone's ability to change direction, and one of those factors is anthropometry. So we think that the acceleration of an object is dependent on its mass and the actual force acting on that object. Okay, we can think of excess body fat, for example, as being non-functional mass. Okay, so it's adding to the weight of an individual but doesn't contribute to the strength of an individual. So it doesn't enable for any greater force production. It's effectively just adding weight and adding to the forces that have been applied through the body without having any beneficial element, okay, from a strictly change of direction perspective. So whilst having a greater relative muscle mass will allow for greater force production, okay, a higher fat mass is going to increase the mass of the individual but not facilitate the development of strength or force in any way. So a higher relative muscle mass compared to body fat will significantly improve someone's ability to change direction effectively. It's not necessarily guaranteed. There's a number of other factors that play into this, but if someone is carrying excess weight and it's carrying excess fat, then that's not going to have a positive impact on change of direction ability. And another factor that influences change of direction is both linear speed and acceleration. So before and after any change of direction, obviously linear speed is going to play a role. Okay, the faster you can cover a set distance, obviously the faster you will be able to get from point A to point B. So having a greater linear speed could play a role. However, it's likely that acceleration probably plays a bigger role in any change of direction. Added to that, it's also the individual's ability to actually brake as well that's going to play a significant role in any change of direction, because the greater capacity for braking and therefore decelerating is going to play a significant role in the individual's ability to change the direction of travel. Okay, if you have a lack of capacity for decelerating, okay, that means it's going to take longer braking phase, okay, and obviously the longer any of those phases goes on for any change of direction, the overall change of direction time is going to significantly increase. So being able to decelerate quickly is obviously going to influence the braking phase time, but then also being able to accelerate quickly is also going to be a key factor as we exit that change of direction. And if we look at some data here, we can see the strength of this relationship between both acceleration and agility and maximal speed and agility. So whilst there are stronger relationships out there, so the relationship of acceleration and maximum speed, for example, is stronger than both acceleration and agility and maximum speed and agility, there is still a significant relationship between the two. So whilst they don't necessarily account for all of the differences across changes of direction, so whilst acceleration and max speed can't both account for the ability to change direction, this data here shows that there is still a relationship. So whilst there are other factors related to an individual's ability to change direction, acceleration and maximal speed can still play a role. So the quicker you accelerate, the quicker your maximal speed does still enable you then to have an increased change of direction. So this will be something we'll explore a little bit more when we look at some of the training considerations for developing both change of direction and for developing agility. Another key factor that influences someone's ability to change direction is strength. Okay, and obviously there are many different types of strength. And if we look at the table here from a study from a few years ago, they explored the relationship and the contribution of different types of strength to change of direction. And what you can see is, whilst we have individual participant data, we also have group overall means, okay, depending on different types of strength measures that they've included. And what they also did, which was nice in this study, was try to equate the actual percentage contribution of different types of strength to change the direction and agility of the movement patterns. And you can see here that dynamic strength had a significant contribution to change the direction, as did eccentric and isometric strength. Concentric strength also played a key role, okay, but power had a less of a role again. Okay, so what this is illustrating is that obviously many different types of strength all contribute to changes of direction. However, it's not uniform across all different types of strength. So different types of strength can have a bigger impact on someone's ability to change direction. And so eccentric strength and isometric strength in particular are important parameters when it comes to change of direction. And obviously we can think of this from a braking phase. Okay, we need a high eccentric component in that braking phase. There's a high isometric component during that stance or transition phase. Okay, and then obviously the dynamic strength is related to then as we accelerate out of that stance phase, okay, as we go into the new direction of travel. So this study highlights nicely just how important strength is to actual change of direction. And if we look in a little bit more detail at this study, okay, here we have the correlations between different types of strength, so our dynamic, eccentric, concentric, isometric, and power strength, and their relationship and correlation with different tests of change of direction and an agility test. And you can see that for the change of direction test, so a T-test and the 505, there's a strong correlation, particularly on eccentric strength, isometric strength, and dynamic strength. But there is also still quite strong correlations between concentric strength and, to a lesser degree, power. But what we can see is a significant difference across these tests is the difference of impact on actual agility. So whilst these strength measures have a strong correlation to change of direction, the correlation is a lot smaller when it comes to measuring actual tests of agility. So as soon as we incorporate a more cognitive component, okay, we see a significant drop in the relationship between these strength metrics and the ability to perform some form of agility movement. So it's just important to highlight when we're thinking about what we actually want to develop in an athlete. Are we just trying to improve their ability to change direction? If so, then obviously strength is going to be a key factor. But if we want to try and develop true agility, then we need to think of other components as well. So while strength will play a role, obviously agility has a change of direction component by definition, but we would also need to incorporate much greater cognitive components to see kind of significant improvements. So again, it's just important for us to understand what metrics it is we're actually trying to develop in an athlete, and therefore the role that different types of training might play. And again, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail in the subsequent session. Now again, if we focus on the role of strength in performance time for any kind of change of direction, then we can see here in this study a negative correlation between eccentric strength, so whether that be extensor or flexor strength, and the performance time for a change of direction. So as the eccentric strength goes down, we see an increase in performance time. So again, just highlighting the importance of eccentric strength in any change of direction and movement. Okay, that ability to brake and absorb those forces that are developed during the braking movement are really important for any change of direction. If we have a weak eccentric strength, it's going to take even longer for that braking to occur. Okay, it's going to probably mean that there'll be more steps involved, okay, because the muscle isn't able to absorb that eccentric load appropriately. So again, just really highlighting just how important eccentric strength is to the ability to change direction quickly and effectively. So as we've mentioned, strength can play a key role in someone's ability to change direction, and some of these factors we've spoken about to some extent when we've spoken about acceleration and maximal speed, because we obviously need to factor in if we have a greater muscle strength, then there is a greater potential for force development within that muscle, and a greater potential for both developing and absorbing force is going to lead to a greater ability for ground reaction forces. And if we can have a greater overall force going through the ground, then that's going to lead to a greater push off. So particularly in the re-acceleration phase, if we can have a greater absolute force development, we should be able to re-accelerate more quickly. And obviously if we can have an increased force, then we know that that's associated with an increased speed of contraction within the muscle as well. So if we combine all these factors together, we have a greater muscle strength, we have a greater ability to absorb force, and with it and also a greater ability to apply force, and also a greater speed of contraction. So if we have greater strength for both absorbing and exerting force with a greater speed of contraction, in theory this should lead to a greater overall change of direction speed, because we're able to decelerate quicker, we're able to then re-accelerate quicker as well. And if we think a little bit more about the role that strength can play in our ability to change direction, then we need to think about the force-velocity relationship. Okay, so whilst obviously we might be able to exert high forces at a low velocity, when we're performing a change of direction, obviously there are periods where we have some slightly longer ground contact times, but fundamentally we want to be able to develop high amounts of force at a high velocity. Okay, so if we're able to develop a higher amount of force at the same velocity, that's going to significantly improve an individual's ability to change direction, particularly through that acceleration phase as we re-accelerate out of the turn. Okay, obviously, for a higher force at a lower velocity can be beneficial, particularly through those braking phases. Okay, but a higher absolute force development at the same velocity is going to lead to a greater ability to accelerate out of the turn. Okay, so therefore it's going to significantly impact on the individual's ability to change direction. And so whilst we've looked at the role of strength, we also need to think about the role of the rate of force development as well. And so we looked at this model somewhat when we were talking about acceleration and maximal speed. And we know that most sporting actions are occurring with a ground contact time of around or below 200 milliseconds. If we remember back to the ground contact times we saw when we looked at the braking profiles from different types of turning, then we know that there's a slightly longer ground contact time, around 200 to 300 milliseconds. However, still relatively short, and so our rate of force development is still going to be really important. And if we then have a high rate of force development, that again is going to significantly improve our ability to accelerate out of a turn. Okay, so whilst again we need to be able to absorb that eccentric load as we brake, having a greater rate of force development, okay, within the same time frame, it's going to have a significant impact on someone's ability to change direction. So this is something that we'll start to look at when we actually look at the training components for improving agility and change of direction. And another factor that influences change direction is reactive strength. Okay, so we've looked at this briefly when we looked at some of the dynamic strength, but there was obviously a greater focus on some of the other isometric and eccentric strength components. But here if we look at reactive strength, so looking at that ability to switch from an eccentric to a concentric muscle action, okay, similar to what we've spoken about with sprinting, so making use of that stretch shorten cycle, then if we look at the correlations here between reactive strength and change of direction and concentric strength between change of direction, we can see that reactive strength on the whole, has a much stronger association with these changes of direction. Now, what's even more interesting is that there is a stronger correlation, again, when we look at the unilateral muscle power strength, so this reactive power strength, across pretty much all of the different changes of direction, whether that be from relatively small angles of say 20 degrees up to around 60 degrees. So whereas there was obviously a strong relationship with the bilateral strength, again we see strong relationships again with the unilateral strength. So obviously with a lot of change of direction, there is a lot of loading unilaterally. So it's just highlighting the importance here of unilateral strength and not just bilateral strength for any changes of direction. And another often overlooked factor that influences change of direction is mobility. Okay, particularly mobility through the hips, knees and ankles. And the role that mobility can play in change direction is that it can allow the body to get into more optimal positioning when going into a change direction. So when both accelerating and decelerating. And we can obviously think of this if we think about our ability to get into a low body position, okay, wide stance, getting that center of mass outside of our stance, okay, having greater mobility is going to enable an athlete to get better force application, okay, get lower to the ground, and have therefore much better force application into the ground. So by having sufficient mobility, then it's going to be really advantageous when it comes to actually changing direction. And again, having good mobility can be particularly beneficial when we're in a disadvantageous position. So when we're in awkward positioning, having good mobility around the key joints can be a significant advantage when it comes to changes of direction. Now, when it actually comes to assessing agility or change of direction, it's important that we understand what different tests are actually measuring. And we can see from this table here that we can break tests down into whether they're measuring change of direction, whether they're measuring maneuverability, or if they've got some perceptual or cognitive component. And what we can see is that the majority of tests that we actually call agility tests don't have the one important component that differentiates agility from change of direction. So they don't contain a perceptual or cognitive component. So our 505 and Pro Agility T-Test, Illinois Test, Agility Run, and L-Run all are either change direction or maneuverability, but don't contain a perceptual component. Now, we should also differentiate between change of direction and maneuverability. So maneuverability, if we see in the T-Test, has both, but in the Illinois and the L-Run, so it's where we see a smaller degree of change of direction, okay, where it's not a complete change of direction, we can keep a high level of velocity. But out of all the tests, there's obviously really only one out of these tests that has both a change of direction a component and a cognitive component. So it's important that we know when we're running a test to assess an athlete's either agility or change of direction capabilities, that we know what the actual test is measuring. And so just to finish off, there are obviously some key considerations or take-home messages that we need to think about when it comes to change of direction and agility. And so in order to be able to change direction effectively, the individual needs to be able to decelerate rapidly and with control, as well as being able to accelerate rapidly out of any change of direction. And whilst obviously strength plays a key role in this, both eccentric particularly and isometric strength in that deceleration phase in particular, but we also need good reactive strength as we accelerate or re-accelerate out of that turn. And so in order to be able to effectively apply force to the floor, body position is a key factor that we need to think about. And having good body position, having good mobility is going to play a key role in an effective and efficient change of direction. And with these body positions, we need to think about the fact that it has both a linear, so forward and back, as well as lateral and rotational components. So we might be decelerating in a linear fashion initially before going into a lateral turn and a stance phase, combining then rotational elements as we finish the turn and as we re-accelerate out of that change of direction. Okay, so that brings the first of these sessions looking at agility to an end. As always, if you have any questions that have arisen from this lecture, then please feel free to get in touch. Either drop me an email and I'll be happy to answer any questions when I can, or if you want to book into my office hours, then you can find details either on Moodle or again you can email me and let me know. Okay, thanks for listening.